For 3 months, the world watched oil prices, watched missiles, watched diplomats announce deals that were not deals. Nobody watched the fields. Nobody watched the soil. The fertilizer is still not moving, and the harvest window is already closed. This is the story behind the story, not the war, not the oil. What happened to the soil while everyone was watching the ships? 90% of every news segment about the Strait of Hormuz focused on one thing: oil. The price at the pump, the barrel price chart. Nobody was talking about sulfur, urea, or phosphate. And that silence will cost the world more than the oil ever did. When I started pulling the data on this story, I expected to find a supply disruption. What I found was something that does not fix itself when the shooting stops. What I found was a countdown already past the point of return. The strait is not open, not even close. Iranian forces laid mines across the waterway. 3 million square meters of water riddled with ordnance that does not care about diplomatic drafts. Clearing those mines takes weeks. Repositioning vessels takes weeks. Rebizzining war risk insurance takes weeks. The strait can be declared open tomorrow. The fertilizer still does not move tomorrow. By March 12th, 150 tankers and bulk carriers were anchored outside the Gulf, unable to get war risk insurance, unable to move, sitting on cargo the world needed 3 weeks ago. Here is the open loop I want you to hold for the rest of this video. A peace deal does not unplant a field. A ceasefire does not replace the fertilizer that never arrived. The harvest does not wait for diplomacy. Here is what the media never explained. The Strait of Hormuz does not just move oil. 20% of the entire world's seaborne fertilizer trade originates from the Arabian Gulf. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, 3 of the top 10 global urea exporters, all of them sitting behind a strait that was effectively closed for nearly 3 months. Their product went nowhere, but urea is only half the story. The Arabian Gulf accounts for 50% of the entire global sulfur trade, and sulfur is not a commodity most people have ever thought about. Until now. Why does sulfur matter? Because without sulfur, there is no phosphate fertilizer. And without phosphate fertilizer, there is no corn, no soybeans, no rice, no wheat. Sulfur is the invisible ingredient the entire food system runs on. Subscribe only if you want the version of events nobody is covering while everyone argues about the ceasefire terms. New story every week. This one is still unfolding. When the strait closed, 35% of the world's seaborne urea and phosphate supply was immediately trapped. Not delayed, trapped. Behind mines, behind insurance refusals, behind a war. Before the crisis, urea traded at around $300 per ton. Analysts now project a peak of $782 per ton by June 2026. That is not a price spike. That is a different world. A farmer in Iowa planning his 2026 corn crop built his budget around $300 urea. He cannot absorb $702. He has 3 choices: plant less, switch crops, or lose money he does not have. That farmer is not alone. This calculation is happening simultaneously on 500 million farms across the world, each one making the same brutal arithmetic. Each one arriving at the same answer: plant less. India saw it coming. In April, the Indian government launched a single emergency tender for 1.6 million tons of fertilizer, the largest single purchase order in the country's history. Panic buying at a national scale: 1.6 million tons. To put that in scale, that is enough fertilizer to fill roughly 32,000 standard shipping containers. India needed all of it at once, because without it, the summer crop cycle fails. Before the war, 100 vessels per day transited the Strait of Hormuz, carrying food and energy inputs. That number fell to near zero in March. 3 months of near zero. 3 months of the world's farms going hungry for inputs they cannot replace. Here is what 3 months of near-zero transit actually means in agricultural terms. The Northern Hemisphere planting window for most staple crops runs from March to June. The closure ran February to May. The timing was not bad luck, it was the worst possible luck. Myanmar imports 90% of its fuel and fertilizer. 90% from routes that run through or near the Gulf. Its farmers have been planting into soil that has not been properly fed since February. Myanmar is not unique, it is just the most visible example. Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sub-Saharan Africa, countries with no buffer, no reserves, no alternative suppliers. The fertilizer did not arrive, and there was no plan B. This is the moment I step back from the data and tell you what the data actually says. No ceasefire announcement changes 1 gram of fertilizer on one field. The crops that needed nutrients in March did not get them. They cannot go back in time. Analysts say even if the strait fully reopens today, supply chains need a minimum of 4 weeks to stabilize and 8 to 13 weeks to return to normal. The planting season does not offer 8 to 13 weeks of patience. The strait is still closed. The harvest is already dead, not metaphorically. Mathematically, the inputs that were supposed to be in the ground in March and April are still sitting on ships that cannot move. The yield deficit is already locked in. Under the worst-case scenario analysts modeled, urea reaches $996 per ton by October 2026. Even under the best case, a deal signed today, prices stay above $700 through November. A deal changes the ceiling. It does not change the floor. Here is what that means for you specifically, not for a government, not for a shipping company, for you. When farmers plant less because inputs cost too much, they produce less food. When they produce less food, the price of what remains goes up. You pay that price at the checkout, not once. For the next 2 years. In the next chapter, I'm going to show you exactly which crops fail first, which countries run out of buffer first, and why the world's largest phosphate producer just became the most important company nobody has heard of. The arithmetic gets worse before it gets better. There is a company most people have never heard of. It is called OCP Group. It is based in Morocco. And right now it is the single most important organization in global food security that is not a government. Morocco controls approximately 35% of global phosphate exports, more than any other single nation on earth. One country, more than a third of the phosphate that feeds the world's crops. To turn raw phosphate rock into DAP and MAP fertilizer, the compounds that actually feed crops, Morocco needs sulfur, enormous quantities of it. Sulfur is the chemical catalyst that converts the rock into something a plant can absorb. No sulfur, no fertilizer, no harvest. Where does Morocco get its sulfur? From the Arabian Gulf. From the same region that was blockaded for 3 months. The world's largest phosphate processor and the world's largest sulfur supply zone, separated by a closed waterway. That is not a supply chain problem. That is a food system failure waiting to be counted. Major phosphate processors typically hold around 150 days of sulfur inventory as a buffer. The closure has already run nearly 90 days. They are not empty yet, but they are not comfortable either, and the clock is still running while diplomats argue about terms. And while Morocco was watching its sulfur buffer drain, China made a decision that sent shockwaves through every agricultural market on the planet. It halted all phosphate exports, not reduced, halted, until at least August. China supplied roughly 30% of global DAP fertilizer exports before the halt. When China exits the market to protect its own domestic supply, the countries that depended on Chinese product have nowhere else to turn. The gap does not close, it widens. When we covered Japan, a country that forgot to exist, I thought dependency was a slow disease. Brazil shows you what happens when dependency meets a sudden shock. Japan took decades to arrive at its crisis. Brazil has months. It imports nearly 85% of its fertilizer with no domestic alternatives at scale. Analysts across Wood Mackenzie, ING, and the University of Illinois all converge on the same projection. Full fertilizer supply chain normalization is not expected until 2027 at the earliest. Next year's harvest is now also in question. This is not a 2026 problem. It is a 2-year problem. Why does it take until 2027? Because agriculture runs on time. You cannot plant corn in July that should have gone in April. You cannot retroactively apply fertilizer to a crop that already set its yield potential in the vegetative stage. The biology does not negotiate. The soil does not care about the negotiations. The crop does not care about the negotiations. The crop does not care about the ceasefire. The planting window closed while the diplomats were still arguing about which table to sit at. That is the verdict. That is what the oil price charts are not showing you. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization warned that more than 100 million people face heightened food insecurity as a direct result of the Hormuz fertilizer disruption, not from the bombs, from the chemistry, from the sulfur that did not move and the phosphate that did not arrive. 100 million people. Imagine the entire population of Egypt. All of it. Now tell me why this was page 4 of every newspaper, while oil prices were the headline. Here is the arithmetic wall. You cannot replant a missed window. You cannot manufacture sulfur from countries that do not have it. You cannot replace 3 months of trapped fertilizer with a diplomatic handshake. The damage is in the ground. Literally. 8 weeks minimum for supply chains to return to normal after reopening. That takes us to late July at the earliest. The Northern Hemisphere summer crop cycle is already past the point where additional fertilizer makes a meaningful difference to 2026 yields. 8 weeks is not fast enough. And here is the part that should make every person watching this stop and think. The countries most exposed to this crisis are not the ones at war. They are the quiet countries. The ones that built their entire agricultural systems around cheap imported fertilizer and assumed the supply would always come. They assumed wrong. And they are about to find out what happens when the assumption fails at scale. Not in a press release, in a harvest, in a market, in a price that doubles, in a meal that is no longer affordable. Go back to that newsroom tonight. Anchors covering the latest round of strikes. The latest round of talks. The latest draft that may or may not hold. None of them showing the field in Maharashtra that was never planted. None of them showing the sulfur ships still at anchor off Alman. None of them showing the fertilizer that was supposed to be in the ground in April. They did not close a shipping lane. They closed the invisible infrastructure of global food production for 3 months. During the one window in the agricultural calendar when it could do the most damage, and the war is still not over, the strait is still closed, the crops are not coming back. That is not a prediction. That is the arithmetic of what already happened. The harvest is already dead, signed deal or no signed deal. And in 6 months, when the food prices arrive at your table, you will know this was never just about oil. Tell me in the comments. The world has spent 3 months watching missiles and oil prices. Nobody is asking what a 3-month fertilizer blockade during the peak planting season does to the harvests that feed 1 billion people. Can a world that built its food system on just-in-time supply chains survive the first time those chains break at exactly the wrong moment? Or did we just find out the answer and nobody noticed because the oil price was the only number anyone was watching?